Good morning, everybody. So great to be here with you again. I've really enjoyed coming here a couple of times now, and it's great to see you all here and to hear about the progress that Taiwan's been making. So I'm just going to talk to you about the progress that investors have been making across the Asia region and also globally, and just to give you a sense of how Asia certainly is a really bright spot globally at the moment. That's very exciting, and I'm really honoured to, as AIGCC also goes into its 10th year this year, very hearty congratulations to Cathay on the 10th anniversary summit, to CK and Sophia and the team. I've been working with Cathay for over 10 years now, actually on their work to incorporate climate into their investments. So just to go through the shifting sort of global dynamics and a little bit just about the Asia Investor Group on climate change for those of you who may not know. So we have three key levers that we work on that are in the orange there. How investors incorporate climate risks and opportunities into their policies and processes, how they engage with the companies that they're part owners of, and how they work with the whole system to ensure that the policies are working towards a net zero transition. So a little bit about the ecosystem and how those three key players that we're involved with, how they can create the change that we need to see across the system. So our theory of change is just how those three pieces interrelate with each other. And this is our sort of internal part of our strategy. Our ultimate goal is the dark green box there. Asian economies that are net zero emissions, they're climate resilient, and they're nature positive. And so we do this by influencing the capital allocation decisions of investors and the companies that they are part owners of. And we do this by, in the number one, to motivate and enable institutional investors to fulfil their legal responsibilities so they can help them understand the economics of climate change, how they assess the financial risks and opportunities of climate and nature, and how they can understand and use their ability to implement Paris-aligned investment practices, how they engage with policymakers, and how they engage with heavy-emitting companies. We work with to help influence corporate decision makers so they can set clear transition plans, including targets, decarbonisation strategies, and capital allocation, and help influence sector and system-wide factors, including public policy. And so investors also have a role to help influence and engage with policymakers so they understand the economics of climate change from an investor's perspective, have the political will to enact accelerating policy that enables more capital to flow, and that incorporates investors' perspectives. So ultimately, this leads to these capital allocation decisions away from unsustainable activities, including fossil fuel-based power generation, deforestation and land conversion, emissions-intensive industry, and high physical risk exposed activities, and obviously towards more economic activities that are more sustainable, as we've already started hearing today, including more renewable energy generation, credible transition technologies, decarbonising industry, and climate adaptation. And this all needs to be done in a fast, fair, but well-planned way so that economies can transition together. So we're moving into a really critical moment for climate capital globally. We heard Mr. Al Gore talking before about this perceived retreat from climate goals globally, whether it's from markets or from some companies. And I guess I just really wanted to give you some information about how investors are seeing this. And certainly from the ultimate asset owners, the institutional investors, this is certainly not the case. In fact, it's actually accelerating and they're doing more and more action and more incorporation on climate. So investors are really showing resilience in the face of these global challenges. But despite this global perceived retreat in climate commitments, and particularly with this geopolitical conflicts that we're seeing, Asian investors are really demonstrating a unique brand of resilience and perseverance. And particularly asset owners like Cathay Financial Holdings, other pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. And so their clients, the asset managers, also need to do more to keep up. Investors recognise that the economic cost of inaction is very severe and projected to affect about 16% of GDP in the region by 2050. And leading asset owners are really proving that strong long-term performance and material emissions reductions can be achieved in parallel. So this is really exciting news. We released a report just a little while ago called the Asia 2030 Climate Playbook, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment, which really establishes this framing around 5%, over 5% long-term annualised returns, while they're achieving 50% emissions reductions to 2030 targets and allocating around 5 to 10% towards climate solutions. And over the last decade, some of the top performing pension funds have achieved an average annualised return of about 6.9% while integrating these factors. So that's really exciting. So we're now moving from ambition to implementation. For investors, we've really moved past this ambition, the target setting, and now into this implementation phase of climate action. And we've already heard from Mr. Gore earlier around, renewables are really the engine of implementation in terms of the real economy and lowering costs. We know that building solar and wind is now cheaper in many parts of Asia than building new coal or gas. In previous studies that we've undertaken, we've looked at the costs for building renewables such as solar, wind and batteries, and we've seen and we're hearing about this exponential decline in costs for these technologies, which is creating a $37 energy investment opportunity by 2050. And it's not just us that are saying this. We're seeing the renewables take over for the first time, taking over coal production and coal as an energy production source for the first time in the modern era. EMBA, a think tank, released its Global Electricity Review for 2026 and finding this unprecedented solar growth globally, and China adding more solar generation in 2025 than in the entire world combined in 2023. And we've heard about a little bit this morning about this rapid electrification across markets with the EV uptake and across particularly Southeast Asia, but also globally, really starting to show, and with the geopolitical conflicts, we're seeing a higher penetration and people moving to EVs to lower their costs of transportation. So I guess just to dig more deeply into what investors are doing and how they're doing this. So setting a net zero target without interim targets, so interim we talk about 2030 or 2035 targets, and credible plan for that transition, it really exposes investors to increasing reputational and implementation risk. So we are seeing implementation accelerate across the region, but there is a gap between commitment and execution that we're seeing. I mentioned before, managing climate risks is really key to investors' fiduciary duty, as they're responsible to protect and grow the retirement savings and pensions of millions of people, or operating on behalf of clients who need to do that. So our recent flagship report, The State of Investor Climate Transition in Asia, which is in the 7th year now, there's near universal recognition of climate risks, with 79% of 240 investors that we surveyed now recognising climate change as a material financial risk. And within our membership, so that's the orange line that's represented there, we have 100% of our membership, which hopefully is not a surprise, recognising climate change as a material financial risk. So really that shows a strong foundation for moving to this awareness phase for investors in the region broadly into really consistent implementation in strategy, governance and stewardship. So what hasn't changed for investors? That climate risk is a material financial risk that has to be managed. And so we're seeing that we need to have active stewardship of the companies that investors are part owners of to help really drive the real economy change. We know that fossil fuel is critical to Asia's energy security needs, with Asia's power sector producing 54% of the region's total carbon emissions. So we know that we can't just divest away from coal and gas immediately. It's not the only solution to Asia. So it's really engaging with these companies to help drive this real economy change, to help these companies transition. And I think what we're really trying to get to is seeing really proactive company and investor and policy dialogues is going to get us to a faster transition when all of those actors start talking together. That's when we really see significant change. So we're starting to see some changes in investors' transition plans. So I mentioned we're moving from setting targets to practical portfolio implementation. And now the transition plans is the detail on how those targets and how those commitments are translated into real action. So investors are increasingly setting and showing commitments and targets, but their stakeholders, the regulators that govern them and their peers, are also questioning the credibility of transition plans as investors are asking companies about their own transition plans. So we need to see evidence of clear pathways, those interim milestones to get us to 2050, and real-world impact. But investors are only just starting to publish more of these granular climate transition plans. We have about 22% of investors more broadly, sort of from this regional cohort of 240 investors. And the reason that we are working very deeply with investors on these transition plans is that they're really a strong indicator that an investor has thought through their strategy to manage climate-related risks, capture opportunities that come from the transition, and align their portfolio strategy with a lower emissions real economy. Most investors in Asia are just showing limited details on the implementation of these plans at the moment, and that's something that we need to do more work on across the region beyond the work that we do with our members. So we know that nobody can take on the climate transition alone. Investors and governments recognise that. And so what we've seen, a real step change in the survey this year, is that investors are really increasing their direct engagement with policymakers across the region, and increasingly doing so through organisations like AIGCC. So we now have around 25% of the broader regional investor set advocating for clearer, more consistent investable frameworks. That's an 18% increase. But AIGCC members have tripled their reporting of policy engagement. So we've really been doing a lot of work with members to support their engagement with policymakers across the region, including here in Taiwan, and all the markets across the region. And we've been doing this for many years, but that has to increase because we need to have that systems approach. If you remember the theory of change diagram, we have to change the whole system, and the system needs to move together. And so that's why that policy engagement is really critical. So just to drill down, and I mentioned the asset owners are really leading this charge. And so we're seeing that, I mentioned in our recent playbook, we're really seeing these asset owners lead and have now overtaken managers in the region. And I mentioned this recent report where we're seeing this greater proportion of asset owners moving into more climate solutions investments. They want to invest more in climate solutions, and they're seeing proof that they can do this and get returns, as well as decarbonising their portfolios. And this is aligned with global asset owners as well. And so I think, you know, these are the very large pools of money, the trillions of dollars when they work together, that is moving in this direction, who want to invest in the transition. But it's really about unlocking the enabling environments and creating the enabling environments so that more of their investments can flow. So you can have a look at that report there, and it really sets out the different types of asset owners that there are for people who are not in the investment world. Hopefully that's useful. And then the rest of the report is for asset owners, really going through all the details of how they might be able to incorporate detailed strategies to integrate climate into their portfolios. And there's case studies of different global asset owners, how they're doing that within their portfolios successfully. So it's a really granular playbook that investors can use and talk about. And we've done roundtables here in Taiwan with investors and all around the region to really support investors, and so they can share and learn from each other in how other investors are doing this. And we're finding this is definitely accelerating investors' action by being in trusted peer groups. So We've heard this morning, and I think it's fairly plain for everybody, and we all understand now that energy security and independence, means we need more renewable energy and ultimately leading to less fossil fuels over time. The things we need to do for climate are the same things we need to do for energy security. The same cause of fossil fuels causing global energy shocks when the supply chains are disrupted, as well as the impacts that fossil fuels are having on climate change. Different issues, but the same solution can resolve this. And that's the exciting moment that we're in and that we really have to double down on. So we've seen that obviously geopolitical conflicts have pushed up oil prices. They haven't deterred climate action. Instead, they're actually transforming renewables as a tool for energy independence and sovereignty and helping to speed up the transition. It may be hard to see that depending on where you sit and which market you're in and the cost of those fossil fuels, but certainly that's a trend that we're seeing in global markets. But obviously we have to, every market, every government has to deal with the short-term shocks to manage the current energy needs, but seeing how increased renewable energy can really help us transition faster to have more energy security independence and obviously the co-benefits that come with that. So we're starting to see that Asia's really ratcheting up its action and doubling down on renewables where that's able to happen. Obviously, China is treating this as a strategic opportunity to consolidate the clean technology manufacturing, and other Asian markets are taking advantage and importing their solar panels and the batteries to speed up their own domestic transitions. Indonesia is looking to fast-track their renewable energy rollout, and in the Philippines are looking at many deals to move them straight past new coal plant development, straight into renewable energy, so that they can bypass that process and move faster to renewables. The other, just going beyond carbon for just a moment, and I think we'll talk a bit more about this in the panel shortly, just going beyond carbon and getting into nature as a material financial risk. Obviously, nature and climate are two sides of that same coin. And we have 53% of GDP across the Asia-Pacific is dependent on nature. And that's direct dependence. The indirect dependence is much higher. And biodiversity is fast becoming a new benchmark for financial stability. We have physical risk and adaptation. We have these extreme weather events I mentioned already, which is going to impact about 16% of GDP in the region by 2050. And adaptation has certainly moved from a new focus to an explicit allocation target by investors now. The social dimension has moved from, it is much more of a place-based just transition. And planning ensures that the transition is practical, fair, it protects local economies, and it ensures social stability. As the Minister said, we need to work with the community. They're the ones who are on the ground, affected by the changes in the climate and also across the economy. So just briefly to finish up, I'm just going to give some specific examples on Taiwan from our recent survey that we released. That you can find online. We have, across the whole survey, as I mentioned, we had the 240 investors across the region, representing about $123 trillion. And this is just sort of the averages of the investors that we surveyed and the different markets that they come from. And then the Taiwanese statistics, so we surveyed 10 investors, and you can see, and so we have about 8 asset owners and 2 asset managers, and many of these are AIGCC members, I'm really glad to say. And so we're seeing in terms of the interim emissions targets that they have and the climate solutions investment, we have 63% of asset owners have full or partial interim targets, so those short-term targets, and 100% of asset managers have climate solutions investments. And I know I'm at time, so I'll be finishing up very shortly, just the last couple of slides for the Taiwanese market. So I talked a little bit about the corporate engagement, how investors engage with the companies that they own. So about 50% of asset owners have climate voting guidelines for their managers. And 100% of asset managers have full or partial guidelines for voting in the companies that they own. And on the target side, for targets for engagement, we're seeing 13% of asset owners have full targets, and another 50% have those partial targets in the pale blue or green there. And 50% of asset managers have engagement targets with their companies. And so this just gives you a sense of how investors are engaging with their companies. On the policy advocacy practice with Taiwanese investors, so we're sitting around about 38% of asset owners and 50% of asset managers are disclosing how they're doing their policy advocacy, and this has increased from the year before. And so it's great to see this uplift in line with the regional trend that I mentioned of that tripling of policy engagement by investors. So that is just a bit of a snapshot on what investors are doing and some of what Taiwanese investors are doing. So please go and have a look at the reports there. And thank you for having me here again today, and really looking forward to the rest of the sessions and providing more insights into how investors are increasing their activity on climate change and benefiting from that as well. Thank you so much.